The world didn't just end in the 14th century. It was methodically dismantled by an invisible killer that turned neighbors into strangers and kings into beggars. We often view the Black Death as a mere tragedy of the past, but it was actually the violent birth of the modern world. If the plague hadn't erased half of Europe, you likely wouldn't be living the life you lead today. The reasons why are far darker than you've been told. The silent arrival and the death of certainty. Imagine a world where the horizon is shrinking, not because of distance, but because the very air seems to have turned against the living. In 1347, a handful of Genoese trading ships limped into the harbor of Messina, Sicily, carrying a cargo far more transformative than silk or spice. They brought a silence that would soon deafen the continent. Within days, the healthy were burying the dead. Within weeks, there were no longer enough living to bury them at all. This wasn't just a medical crisis. It was the moment human certainty died. For centuries, the medieval mind rested on a bedrock of absolute order. You knew your place, you knew your God, and you knew that the world operated under a divine, predictable rhythm. But how do you reconcile that rhythm with a boil the size of an apple that kills a man in 3 days? The arrival of the Yersinia pestis bacterium was the ultimate disruptor, an invisible invader that ignored city walls, disregarded prayers, and bypassed the status of the nobility. It was the first time in history that the entire machinery of civilization simply stopped. As the plague swept through the narrow, filth-strewn streets of Europe's burgeoning cities, it didn't just take lives, it took the logic of existence. People watched as the pious died alongside the wicked, and the wealthy succumbed as quickly as the beggars. Can you imagine the sheer psychological terror of realizing that neither your gold nor your goodness offered a shield? This was the beginning of a profound existential crisis. The terror wasn't just in the dying, it was in the realization that the old rules, the ones that had governed humanity for a millennium, no longer applied. Every ship that docked and every traveler who fled a doomed city carried the seeds of a total societal reset. Families abandoned one another. Mothers left children, and husbands fled from wives, driven by a primal, desperate instinct to outrun a ghost. This was the death of certainty. As we watch the foundations of the 14th century crumble, we have to ask ourselves, when the world as you know it vanishes overnight, what fills the void? What happens to a civilization when it realizes its protectors are powerless and its leaders are just as mortal as the peasants they rule? The answer began in the shadows of the plague houses, where the first cracks in the old world's armor began to split wide open. The day the social ladder collapsed. What happens to a kingdom when the king's crown can no longer command a plowman to work? In the wake of the Great Mortality, the most rigid social structure in human history, the feudal system didn't just bend. It shattered under the weight of too many empty chairs. For 1,000 years, you were born into a station, lived in that station, and died in that station. But suddenly, the survivors found themselves standing in a world where the sheer scarcity of human life had turned the humble peasant into the most valuable commodity on earth. Before the plague, Europe was a pressure cooker of overpopulation. Land was scarce, food was expensive, and labor was dirt cheap. If a serf complained, there were 10 others waiting to take his place in the mud. But as the bodies piled up in the village squares, the math of power underwent a violent inversion. Landowners looked out at rotting harvests and realized that their titles meant nothing if there were no hands to reap the grain. Have you ever considered that the middle class wasn't born from a peaceful evolution, but from the desperate leverage of survivors who realized they were finally worth more than the dirt they walked on? This was the day the social ladder collapsed. In England and France, the surviving peasantry did the unthinkable. They walked away. They left the manners of their ancestors, ignoring the laws that tied them to the soil, and moved toward the highest bidder. When the nobility tried to pass laws to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, they weren't met with obedience, but with a simmering, righteous fury that eventually boiled over into open revolt. The peasant was no longer a faceless tool of the aristocracy. They were a negotiator. The psychological shift here is staggering. For the first time, a commoner could look at a lord and realize that the lord needed them more than they needed the lord. This wasn't just an economic change. It was a fundamental rewiring of the human ego. The great chain of being that supposedly linked the peasant to the heavens through the king had been snapped. If the social order was truly divine, why had it failed to protect the righteous? As the dust settled on the mass graves, the survivors looked at the vacant manors and realized that if the old world was gone, they were the ones who would have to build the new one, and they wouldn't be doing it for free. Does this make you wonder How much of our modern obsession with market value is simply a lingering echo of that 14th century survival instinct? Labor's bloody revolution, from serfdom to power. If you've ever negotiated a salary or demanded better working conditions, you were exercising a power that was paid for in 14th century blood. The Black Death didn't just kill people. It killed the very idea that some humans were born to serve while others were born to rule. When the fields stood silent and the grain began to rot, the few who remained realized they held a terrifying new weapon, their own labor. As the population plummeted by nearly 50%, the remaining workforce found themselves in a position that would have been unthinkable just a decade prior. For the first time in European history, the supply of labor was drastically lower than the demand. Imagine being a serf who had spent your entire life tied to a single plot of land, forbidden from leaving on pain of death. Suddenly, the lord of a neighboring estate, desperate to save his fortune, whispers a promise of actual silver coins if you just abandon your post and work for him. Would you stay out of loyalty to a system that failed to protect your family from the plague? Or would you seize the chance to finally own your life? The ruling class reacted with predictable panic. In 1351, the English Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers, a desperate attempt to force wages back to pre-plague levels and make it a crime for a peasant to seek better pay. It was an attempt to legislate the past back into existence. But how do you enforce a law when the bailiffs, the jailers, and the tax collectors are all dead? The friction between a desperate aristocracy and a newly empowered peasantry created a spark that would eventually ignite the peasants' revolt. This wasn't just about money. It was a revolution of the spirit. The survivors began to ask dangerous questions. If we all bleed the same red blood and die from the same black sores, why is one man a lord and another a slave? This period saw the rise of the artisan and the skilled tradesman. Because labor was so expensive, people had to innovate. We started seeing the introduction of labor-saving devices, better water mills, and improved heavy plows. The high cost of human hands forced the human mind to become more efficient. Can you see the irony? The greatest catastrophe in human history was the very thing that forced humanity to start valuing human time. We moved from a world of static duty to a world of competitive value. The bloody fields of the 1300s were the unlikely nursery for the concept of individual worth. But as the people began to find their power on earth, they started to look upward and realize that the other great pillar of their world, the church, was also beginning to crumble. The church's fractured monopoly. What happens to a soul when the gateway to heaven is locked by a corpse? For centuries, the Catholic Church wasn't just a religion. It was the literal interface between reality and the afterlife, a monopoly on salvation that no one dared to question. But as the plague tore through the cloisters, the faithful watched in horror as the holiest men among them fell, just as fast and often faster than the sinners. The Black Death didn't just kill the clergy, it killed the illusion of their divine protection. In the medieval mind, disease was the physical manifestation of God's wrath. When the pestilence struck, the masses flocked to the cathedrals, begging for intercession. But the church had no answers. Priests, in their duty to administer last rites, were exposed to the front lines of the infection, dying in such staggering numbers that the institution began to hollow out from the inside. In some regions, there were so few priests left that the Pope was forced to grant permission for lay people and even women to confess their sins to one another. Can you grasp the magnitude of that shift? If a commoner could hear a confession, why did they need the massive gilded hierarchy of Rome? As the veteran, learned bishops died off, the church scrambled to fill the void, ordaining young, uneducated, and often corrupt men just to keep the doors open. The quality of the clergy plummeted, and with it, the respect of the people. The survivors began to see the church not as an infallible shield, but as a flawed, human institution that had failed them at their hour of greatest need. This was the birth of the priesthood of all believers, a quiet, simmering realization that the individual's relationship with God might not require a middleman. This spiritual vacuum led to two extremes. On one hand, you had the flagellance mobs of radicals who whipped themselves in the streets, believing that if the church couldn't appease God, they would have to do it through their own blood. On the other hand, you had the skeptics and the early reformers. They began to translate the Bible into common languages, bypassing the Latin-speaking elite. The Black Death created a world of spiritual DIY. If the plague hadn't decimated the ranks of the faithful and exposed the church's helplessness, would the Protestant Reformation have even been possible 2 centuries later? The monopoly was fractured. The church remained powerful, but it was no longer unquestioned. For the first time, people were looking for answers elsewhere, and when they stopped looking toward the heavens for a cure, they finally started looking at the world beneath their feet. Science born from the pyres of superstition. When the gods fail to stop a massacre, humanity is forced to pick up the scalpel. For over 1,000 years, medical knowledge in the West was a stagnant pool of ancient Greek theories and religious dogma, where healing usually meant balancing invisible humors or praying away a curse. But you cannot pray away a bacterium that liquefies the lungs. The Black Death was the brutal wake-up call that dragged the human mind out of the dark and into the cold, clinical light of observation. Before the plague, the human body was considered a sacred vessel, and cutting it open was often viewed as a spiritual taboo. But as the traditional remedies of rosewater and vinegar failed to save millions, a desperate, gritty pragmatism took hold. Doctors realized that the texts of Galen and Aristotle were useless against the black boils of the dying. For the first time, physicians began to prioritize what they saw over what they were told. They started performing more frequent autopsies, driven by a morbid, urgent curiosity to see exactly what this invisible killer was doing to the organs inside. This shift from why to how was the silent birth of the scientific method. In the height of the panic, the concept of quarantine derived from the Italian 40 giorni, or 40 days, was born in the port of Ragusa. This wasn't based on a theological decree, but on a raw, empirical observation. If you keep the sick away from the healthy for long enough, the dying stops. It was the first time in history that human beings successfully used large-scale, organized public health measures to combat an invisible enemy. The failure of the miracle forced the creation of the university as a place of inquiry rather than just recitation. New medical schools began to emerge that emphasized anatomy and surgery over philosophy. We began to see the rise of the surgeon, once a lowly trade equated with barber's ass, a vital, life-saving professional. People stopped asking which saint they had offended and started asking how the water was flowing and where the waste was going. Can you see the pivot point here? The Black Death forced us to admit that we were ignorant, and in that admission of ignorance lay the seed of every medical breakthrough we've ever had. By shattering our faith in ancient certainties, the plague cleared the ground for a world where we rely on data, observation, and evidence. We stopped looking for the sin in the blood and started looking for the cause. But while the mind was waking up, the continent's coffers were being completely rewritten. The economic rebirth of a ghost continent. What if the key to the greatest economic explosion in history wasn't more people, but fewer? It is one of history's most haunting ironies. The Black Death, while stealing millions of lives, essentially handed a fortune to the survivors. It took a world that was starving, crowded, and stagnant, and transformed it into a land of abundance, where the average person suddenly had more land, more food, and more gold than their ancestors could have dreamed of. Before the plague, Europe was trapped in a Malthusian deadlock. There were too many mouths to feed, and not enough fertile soil to go around. People were farming marginal, rocky hillsides just to survive, and the price of grain was astronomical. But after the Great Mortality, the math flipped. With half the consumers gone, the price of food plummeted. Suddenly, the survivors weren't just eating to stay alive. They had a surplus. They had discretionary income, a concept that had effectively been non-existent for the lower classes for centuries. Have you ever wondered why the golden age of the English laborer followed the darkest period of human suffering? With fewer people to work the land that was worked was the best, most fertile soil available. Yields went up, but more importantly, the economy began to diversify. Since grain was cheap and labor was expensive, landowners shifted from labor-intensive crops to livestock. This meant more meat, more leather, and more wool. This transition didn't just change the diet of Europe, it fueled the massive textile industries that would eventually build the great cities of the Renaissance. This was the moment capital became fluid, because people were inheriting the wealth of deceased relatives, sometimes several entire families. Worth of property falling to a single survivor wealth was consolidated and then spent. We see a sudden explosion in the demand for luxury goods. Silks, spices, and fine craftsmanship were no longer just for the top 0.1%. A new class of merchants and skilled artisans rose to meet this demand, creating the commercial infrastructure of modern banking and trade. The plague acted as a violent redistribution of wealth. It broke the monopoly of the landed elite and forced a stagnant economy to become dynamic and consumer-driven. It was a great leveling. But this new wealth brought a new kind of pressure. As people moved into the cities to claim their new lives, they weren't just carrying gold. They were carrying a new, hardened sense of self. When the economy changed, the very way we viewed our place in the universe had to change with it. The psychological scar, how the plague invented the individual. What happens to your mind when you realize that the person standing next to you, your priest, your lord, or even your parent is just as fragile and frightened as you are? Before the 14th century, the individual barely existed. You were a cell in the body of the church, or a cog in the machine of the manor. But the Black Death acted as a terrifying mirror, forcing every survivor to look inward and realize that in the face of the ultimate dark, you are fundamentally alone. The trauma of the plague created a profound shift in the European psyche. The birth of the memento mori, the obsession with the inevitability of death. You see it in the art of the era, the dance of death, where skeletons lead emperors and peasants alike to the grave. This wasn't just macabre fascination, it was a psychological coping mechanism. If death could strike at any second, the old medieval habit of waiting for your reward in the next life began to feel like a sucker bet. People began to live for the now. This carpe diem mentality was the unexpected engine of the Renaissance. The survivors had seen the world end and realized they were still standing. This led to a newfound confidence, a sense that the human experience was something to be explored, recorded, and celebrated. We see it in the literature of the time, like Boccaccio's Decameron, where individuals tell their own stories to pass the time while the plague rages outside. The focus shifted from the eternal to the human. Have you ever considered that our modern obsession with legacy and personal achievement is a direct descendant of this trauma? When the collective institutions of society failed to provide safety, people began to rely on themselves. This was the era where artists started signing their work. Before the plague, a cathedral was built by anonymous hands for the glory of God. After the plague, the individual architect, the individual painter, and the individual merchant wanted their names remembered. This psychological scarring also brought a darker edge to the human spirit. The survivor's guilt and the constant proximity to death made society more violent, more erratic, but also more restless and ambitious. The safety of the group had been proven a lie. The individual was now the primary unit of reality. We stopped being part of a flock and started being the masters of our own fates, or at least we desperately wanted to believe we were. This newfound individualism was the final spark needed to light the fire of the modern age. The long shadow of the great mortality. We are the children of a catastrophe we have largely forgotten. We look back at the 14th century as a distant, dusty chapter of history, but if you look closely at the architecture of our world, our hospitals, our wages, our very concept of freedom, you can still see the fingerprints of the plague. The Black Death didn't just end an era. It acted as a violent filter, straining out the old world and leaving behind the raw materials of the new one. The legacy of the great mortality is found in the paradox of progress born from pain. It forced a stagnant Europe to innovate, to question, and to value the individual life in a way that had never been seen before. When we talk about the rise of the West, we are often talking about a recovery process. The Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and the Enlightenment weren't just random strokes of genius. They were the long-term results of a society that had been forced to rebuild itself from the ashes of a total collapse. Think about the way we handle a modern crisis. When we implement public health policies or debate the essential nature of labor, we are using a vocabulary that was written in the wake of 1347. The plague taught us that the health of the poorest beggar is inextricably linked to the health of the richest king, a lesson in human connectivity that we are still trying to master today. It proved that human systems are fragile, but human resilience is nearly limitless. Is it possible that we need these moments of absolute disruption to move forward? The Black Death was a horror beyond comprehension, yet it broke the chains of serfdom and opened the doors of the laboratory. It ended the monopoly of the few and began the empowerment of the many. As we move further into our own uncertain future, we have to ask, what are the invisible killers of our time, and are we brave enough to let the structures they threaten fall away to make room for what comes next? The story of the Black Death isn't a story about how we died. It's a story about how we chose to live once the silence finally ended. We didn't just survive the plague, we let it rewire us. And in that rewiring, the modern world was born.